Number 9. Buried MiG-21 fighter jet. In 2017, the Prague Rudolfinum Gallery celebrated its 100th exhibition by ceremonially burying a Soviet MiG-21 supersonic fighter jet in the Czech village of Dolní Březany. British contemporary artist Roger Hyorns came up with the idea as a symbolic way to mark the end of an era that saw the development of MiG planes and other war machines. By putting a plane, something that is typically in the sky, into the ground, the event was a funeral of sorts. It was Hyorns' way of saying goodbye to a distinctive period in history. The Mikoyan Gruvich MiG-21 was developed in the 1950s as Cold War tensions ramped up between the Soviet Union and the United States. Over 10,000 were produced, and they've been used by militaries in over 50 countries. Some are still in use today, making the MiG-21 the longest manufactured and most widely used fighter aircraft in history. The plane that Hyorns buried was built in 1971 and decommissioned in 1996. Finding a MiG-21 and getting all the necessary paperwork out of the way were just one step of the process. The project required decontaminating the jet, conserving it to prevent future pollution, and assembling workers and equipment to carry out the burial. This is the second plane that Hyorns has put in the ground as part of his vision of burying an entire fleet of aircraft in various places throughout the world. Number 8. Auradour Sir Glenn. On June 10, 1944, the Nazis entered the French village of Auradour Sir Glenn and demanded to see the residents' identity papers. They locked the women and children in a church and forced the men into a separate building. Then, they massacred and looted the village, killing 643 people in just a few hours' time. Only 6 people survived the ordeal, in addition to 20 who had fled immediately upon the Nazis' arrival. One of them said that the Nazis shot the men in the legs until they couldn't move, then set the building on fire, leaving the victims to slowly perish. After that, the Nazi soldiers blew up the church, causing the women and children to flee through the windows. Those who tried to escape were shot to death with machine guns. SS Commander Adolf Deichmann claimed that the massacre was in retaliation for the kidnapping and murder of a fellow officer. The survivors were allowed to return to Auradour Sir Glenn a week later to bury the dead. They built a new village nearby. After the war, General Charles de Gaulle decided not to allow the destroyed town to be rebuilt. He ordered for it to be preserved as a memorial dedicated to the lives lost and as a reminder of the Nazis' cruelty. Today, it sits in ruins. There's a museum at the ghost town's entrance with a memorial bearing the names of all the victims. It may seem morbid to some to preserve the remains of such a traumatic event, but by inviting visitors to reflect on what happened at Auradour Sir Glenn, the site keeps the senseless atrocities of hatred and war at the forefront of the national consciousness. Number 7. USS Grenadier. The U.S. Navy submarine USS Grenadier was scuttled in 1943 after being hit by Japanese bombs in the Strait of Malacca, roughly 92 miles off the coast of Phuket, Thailand. Its 76-man crew survived, only to be taken prisoner by the Japanese. For 2 years, they were beaten, tortured, and starved. Miraculously, all but 4 of the POWs lived to tell their story. In 2019, an expedition found a 307-foot-long submarine resting 285 feet below the water's surface with its hatches open. Exploring the site was complicated due to its depth, requiring the divers to make several brief visits. They had to breathe a special combination of oxygen, nitrogen, and helium, and could only stay at the wreck for a few minutes at a time. Based on its measurements and its location between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, the divers believe that the sunken submarine is the USS Grenadier. They sent the information along to the Naval History and Heritage Command, which is the agency in charge of verifying naval wrecks. Once confirmed, the submarine will fall under the protection of the Sunken Military Craft Act, which bans the disturbance of military vehicles owned by the US government regardless of where they are found. Number 6. Invisible pollution. Grunard Island is a small, uninhabited island that sits less than a mile, 0.6 kilometers, off the Scottish coast. In 1942, it became home to a top-secret testing facility for biological weapons. It is here that the UK government experimented with a deadly strain of anthrax called Volum 14578 by packing the pathogen into bombs and deploying the weapons on innocent flocks of sheep. The results showed that the Volum 14578 could contaminate entire German cities for decades. Consequently, the tests left Grenadier Island heavily polluted. During the 1980s, an environmental organization called Operation Dark Harvest began writing to newspapers about the toxic conditions at Grenadier. They claimed that 2 scientists had visited the site firsthand and collected soil samples, which the group threatened to leave in places that would make it impossible for the British government to ignore. The activists made good on their threat by leaving a sample outside the Porton Down Military Research Facility, where tests confirmed that the soil contained anthrax. Decontamination efforts began in 1986. The most heavily contaminated soil was removed, and the entire island was sprayed with a formaldehyde solution diluted in seawater. To ensure that the cleanup was a success, a flock of sheep was left behind. They remained mostly healthy, and in 1990, Grenadier Island was officially declared anthrax-free. None of the sheep have tested positive for the poison since 2007. The details of what went on at Grenadier Island became publicly available for the first time in 1997, when documents about the biological warfare project were declassified. Some people believe that the site could still be toxic, but nobody will probably be going there anytime soon anyway, because it's privately owned. Number 5. Frozen Shelter. During World War I, a group of 20 Austro-Hungarian soldiers built a crude wooden shelter in the Italian Alps atop a 10,154-foot, 3,095-meter peak called Mount Scorluzzo. They spent the next 3.5 years living in the cramped, makeshift space while fighting the Italians in a long, drawn-out battle known as the White War. By the time the war ended in 1918, the soldiers had had enough of the unforgiving alpine climate, which saw winter temperatures as low as -40 degrees Fahrenheit, -40 degrees Celsius. They abruptly closed up the shelter and abandoned it, leaving behind most of their belongings. The only people who went up there before the site was once again covered in ice were scrappers looking for metal to resell. Relics from the White War were first discovered during the 1990s as global warming accelerated the melting of glaciers. Since then, an array of perfectly preserved artifacts have appeared, including letters, diaries, weapons, and other personal belongings. Soldiers' bodies have also been recovered. Researchers entered the barracks on Mount Scorluzzo for the first time in 2017 after the ice that had encased it for nearly 100 years had melted away. They found food, dishes, bottles, animal skin jackets, straw mattresses, coins, helmets, ammunition, and other items that reflect the troops' dismal daily lives. Of the 150,000 men who died in the White War, roughly 2/3 were killed by avalanches, frostbite, landslides, illness, and other circumstances relating to the harsh environment. The shelter on Mount Scorluzzo is just one of many that have been discovered in recent decades, seemingly frozen in time. It's likely that more of these sites will appear as climate change continues to dramatically alter the landscape. Climate change is a decidedly negative thing overall, but there have definitely been some pretty cool discoveries thanks to the softening of several frozen areas. Do you know of any other interesting discoveries thanks to the thawing caused by global warming? Let us know in the comments below and make sure to like and subscribe. Number 4. Love letters. During renovations at the Esplanade Hotel in Scarborough, England, earlier this year, workers found a trove of World War II artifacts hidden beneath the floorboards of a utility room. The collection includes an old Vaseline tin, old cigarette packs, toothpaste tubes, and candy wrappers. There's also a handful of letters that were exchanged by a couple who were deeply in love. The pair wrote about trivial details of their everyday lives, like the weather, outings with friends, and having sore gums from an abscess. They also expressed feeling lonely and depressed, and thinking about each other as their days apart painfully dragged by. One letter states, "Wherever you go, my darling, don't ever forget that I love you more than anything else on earth." The letters aren't signed, but the Scarborough Historical and Archaeological Society, SHAC, is hoping to identify the writers. They believe that the correspondence dates back to sometime between 1941 and 1944, and that one of the parties may have been a British soldier from one of the numerous military units that were stationed at the hotel throughout the war. The woman wrote a return address on one of the letters, which was traced to a couple named Jesse and James McConnell. Their son, John, served in the Royal Air Force before dying tragically in a plane crash in 1943 at just 19 years old. Researchers believe that the letters could have been exchanged between John and his girlfriend. It's a strong lead, but it's still being investigated. The Shack is hoping to find more World War II relics inside the hotel, but on and off lockdown restrictions have slowed down their search. Discoveries like this may not be worth a lot of money, but they are treasures in their own right, offering a first-hand glimpse into the traumas of war and the emotional struggles that came along with being separated from loved ones. Number 3. Lun Ecrunoplan. Ground effect vehicles look like airplanes, but they're a little different. They travel close to the ground or water, using their wings to generate lift and reduce drag. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union developed several of these low-flying machines. One of them is the Lun Ecrunoplan, nicknamed the Caspian Sea Monster. It was designed during the 1970s. The only prototype that was ever completed served in the Soviet and Russian navies from 1987 until sometime during the late 90s. Known as the MD-60, it had large wings that flew roughly 13 feet, 4 meters above the water's surface. Equipped with 8 large turbofans, it had a maximum cruising speed of 340 miles per hour. The Ecrunoplan was armed for anti-surface warfare, carrying 6 missile launchers grouped in pairs of 2. It had no chassis, which meant that it couldn't travel on land. Instead, the machine was stored on a custom-built dry floating dock, which was towed out into the water and submerged, leaving the Ecrunoplan floating and ready to power up and go. The MD-60 could remain self-sufficient for up to 5 days at a time. At the time, it was the world's heaviest aircraft in operation. Today, the MD-60 sits abandoned at a naval base in Kaspiysk, Russia. The only other planned Lun-class Ecrunoplan was intended to serve as a mobile hospital. Military funding for the project was cut off when the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving it 90% finished. Number 2. Valley of Death Massacre. When the Nazis realized that they were going to lose World War II, they scrambled to hide evidence of their war crimes. In January of 1945, they marched 50 prisoners into the woods in northern Poland and shot them to death, one by one at close range. The victims' bodies were burned and buried in a mass grave. Until recently, this and another massacre that had happened nearby in 1939 were only known based on eyewitness accounts. Archaeologists finally discovered physical evidence of the atrocities this year while excavating in the area. The team dug up a morbid array of artifacts, including burnt human bones, jewelry, cigarette lighters, and bullet casings. Many massacres like this happened outside of concentration camps during the war, but these sites are rarely studied out of respect for Jewish beliefs, which prohibit the disturbance of human burials. The recently discovered site is located in a region nicknamed the Valley of Death, where the Nazis murdered hundreds of priests, intellectuals, disabled people, and Jewish families. Personal belongings have helped to identify some of the victims' remains. Experts are performing DNA tests in hopes of naming more victims and finding any surviving relatives. But it's unlikely that they'll identify every person due to the sheer number of killings that happened there. After the testing is done, the remains will be respectfully reburied in the town of Chodnice. Number 1. Red Army Tank. In 2015, workers discovered an abandoned Red Army tank in a swamp near the town of Sino in Belarus, where it had gotten stuck in the mud during World War II. Known as the Klement Voroshilov 1 or KV-1, the model was named after a Soviet Union marshal and dates as far back as 1941, the same year the Germans invaded Belarus. At the time, it was the standard heavy tank of the Soviet military. The KV-1 was extremely effective against most German anti-tank weapons, thanks to its heavy armored plate. Salvage crews worked together to remove the tank from the swamp, where it had sat for over 70 years. Video footage of the recovery shows obvious damage to the vehicle, but it was unclear whether someone destroyed it on purpose before it got stuck in the mud, or if it was damaged after it became stranded. The tank may have been used in the 1941 Battle of Sano, which saw 2,250 of the vehicles go head-to-head in one of World War II's biggest tank battles. Both the Red Army and the Nazis suffered big losses, but the Soviets ultimately lost. This greatly weakened the area's Red Army troops, making it much easier for the Germans to advance through the region. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to learn more about fascinating wartime discoveries, let me know in the comments below and be sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time.